Hello everyone and welcome to this NAIEPP webinar. The title of today's webinar is The Status of Worldwide Nuclear Arsenals, and today's guest is Hans M. Kristensen, one of the world-leading experts on nuclear weapons. So first, a warm welcome to you, Hans. We're delighted to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
So, Mr. Kristensen, you have had a 40-year-long career doing research on nuclear weapons, first joining Greenpeace in 1982 as coordinator for their disarmament campaign, and after that, Mr. Kristensen has worked for several prominent peace and nuclear weapons organizations such as the Natural Resources Defense Council and the Nautilus Institute. And since 2005, Hans Kristensen has been the director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists based in Washington, D.C., FAS. And in short, FAS is a world-renowned research-based institute founded in 1945 by scientists working on the Manhattan Project. And besides analyzing and commenting on the development of nuclear weapons, Mr. Kristensen is responsible for the publication of the Nuclear Notebook, which is widely regarded as the most accurate piece of information on nuclear weapons and weapons facilities to the public. And for example, the Peace Institute SIPRI refers to Hans's data when reporting the global status of nuclear weapons in SIPRI's annual yearbook. So Mr. Kristensen, is this an accurate introduction? And please feel free to add further information about yourself and FAS.
That's a very good capture over the years. And it's also an appropriate introduction in the sense of the times we're in right now. Because like you started saying, I began sort of as an activist in Europe during the Cold War. And what motivated me, and in those days, and a lot of people, of course, was the crazy arms race and the threats that we faced during that very intense standoff between East and West. Then we've had a window of a couple of decades where things were relaxing and moving in another direction. But now we're again seeing sort of a revival of the standoff between East and West, very much based on some of the thinking that underpinned the Cold War, military responses, threatening postures, all these things. So it's sort of appropriate to sort of come from that background, if you will, and say we've been in this before. We had a chance. Now we're seeing nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapons developments going in the wrong direction again.
Thank you, Mr. Kristensen. And so the structure of the webinar, there will be 3 discussion sections, and at the end of the first 2 sections, we'll have the questions from the audience. And please, only short questions, that we'll have, time for as many questions as possible during these 30 minutes we have at our disposal. And for this webinar, I, Oscar Brunzell, co-president of the Nordic Association of IAEPP Paris, will be the moderator, and Blanche, representing Hexagon, the Association of Security and Defense at Sciences Po Paris, will be the co-moderator. And Blanche will be in charge of the questions in the chat. She'll read them out loud, and when reading out the questions, she will say the first name of the person who posted the question. And it should also notice that this webinar will be recorded, and you will find it uploaded on NAIEPP's website. So that was the formality of the webinar. So let's begin with the discussion. 30 years ago, there were more than 70,000 nuclear warheads or nuclear weapons on the planet, and today this number has been reduced a mere fifth, in other words, just about 13,000 remaining warheads, which is good. However, the yield of nuclear weapons today is much larger, which is bad. And starting with the SALT agreement in 1969, there's always been nuclear weapons agreements between the 2 superpowers on nuclear weapons, the US and Russia. In 2019, the important INF Treaty on the elimination of the 2 countries' intermediate-range and short-range missiles was cancelled due to mistrust between the countries. And the only agreement we have today is the new START Treaty, which runs until 2026, which, however, does not cover 60 to 65% of the active nuclear stockpiles of the 2 countries. And also, with the recent Taliban overthrow of the Afghan government and the nuclear weapons of the neighbor and to some degree radicalized Pakistan, for the less knowledgeable, it feels like nuclear weapons might soon be in the hands of radicals. And lastly, this summer 2021, FAS revealed that China was building 2 more silo missile fields with the capacity to double its number of nuclear warheads. And in a FAS report with Matt Korda, Hans M. Kristensen wrote that the Chinese missile silo program constitutes the most extensive silo construction since the US and Soviet missile silo construction during the Cold War. And with this short summary, Mr. Kristensen, my first question is, how dangerous is the situation today worldwide regarding nuclear weapons?
It's getting worse. The point is that all the nuclear weapon states are very busy modernizing their nuclear arsenals, but not only for the long-term duration of their deterrence postures, but also beginning to signal with nuclear weapons in different ways, more intense ways that they didn't do just 10 years ago. But it's important not to compare today to the Cold War directly, because the nuclear standoff during the Cold War was much more intense and the dangers much more vivid. The kind of risk we see today is not between East and West, the risk that a nuclear war will break out, sort of just like that, but more that the two sides can get deep into a conventional conflict. And from that escalate into limited first use of nuclear weapons, and then all bets are off from there. That's in the East-West relationship, but it's also important to look at the relationship between other countries, for example, India and Pakistan. They've had many border disputes over the decades, and the two sides are modernizing and expanding their nuclear arsenals significantly. That is an area where people think that, if nuclear weapons were to come to use in the short term, that could be one of the flashpoints. So there are lots of different ways that things are moving in the wrong direction, but they're doing it in different ways depending on who's involved and where you are.
Thank you, Mr. Kristensen. And what is the risk that one of the less democratic countries will develop an extensive number of nuclear warheads and will become a nuclear powerhouse?
Well, so far, most of the democratic countries, if you could say, have resisted, other than India, have resisted sort of a rapid, significant buildup. I mean, obviously, the Indian buildup is significant because it's a relatively young nuclear weapon state, and they're already at the level of around 150 nuclear warheads in their arsenal. That pales in comparison to the number of weapons that the United States and Russia have in their arsenal. What we're now seeing is that countries such as Russia, China, Pakistan, India, North Korea are, and also recently Britain, are increasing their nuclear stockpiles. Those are the warheads that are assigned to use by the military forces. The United States, France, and Israel are still relatively stable. They may modernize and introduce some enhanced versions, etc., but they're not increasing their numbers the way that the other countries are. So we're not really in a numerical arms race yet. We're more in a technological and sort of strategic arms race where we're competing against, again, with the way we use and talk about nuclear weapons.
Thank you, Mr. Kristensen. And if we change the focus to Europe, the US has nuclear weapons in 4 EU countries and Turkey. Meanwhile, the UK and France have their own nuclear weapons. And at the same time, Russia seems to engage more in Europe, close to the NATO borders and in Kaliningrad, and in developing its conventional forces, etc. My question is, how do you view the situation in Europe today regarding nuclear weapons?
It's getting more intense. After a period where nuclear weapons were really fading into the background in terms of deployments in Europe, things are becoming more intense again. We see that in several ways, but different ways depending on the countries involved. Russia has been increasing its number of nuclear weapons, including the types of non-strategic nuclear weapons that it operates. They're not operationally deployed at the bases. They're in central storage, but the warheads can obviously be brought to the delivery systems relatively quickly. But we see them as sort of being modernized and having increased capabilities and reaching further than they could before. But on the United States, we see sort of a posture that has had in Europe for many decades now. It's not increasing it, the posture, it's maintaining it, modernizing it, enhancing the capabilities. And in Britain, we've just seen a new development where they've come out and announced that they want to increase their nuclear weapons stockpile over the next decade, in contrast to their previous plans of reducing the stockpile. France is a little more stable when it comes to numerical numbers of nuclear weapons, but they do modernize and are enhancing their capabilities as part of their modernization. So it very much depends on the countries, but all countries, or more or less all of them in Europe, are sort of flagging their nuclear forces more actively, if you will, than they did just a decade ago. And so the risk here, again, is not that we sort of stumble into a nuclear war directly. The risk is more that the general military competition and tension between the two sides builds up, and out of that erupts a conventional conflict that can then draw in nuclear forces. That's the risk we're facing.
Great, excellent. And when considering Europe's great nuclear power, France, when President de Gaulle initiated French nuclear weapons in 1960, it was done during the height of the Cold War. And in 2019, President Macron declared that the French should spend 25 billion euros for the years 2019-2023 on French nuclear weapons. And the reason for French nuclear weapons is usually summed up in the 3 points. 1, ensuring that France's survival cannot be called into question by a major power. 2, preserving the country's freedom of action in the face of regional actors seeking to blackmail it. And 3, contributing to the security of Europe and the Atlantic Alliance. My question is, do you agree with the French standpoints about the importance of French nuclear weapons for France and for Europe?
It's not really for me to say whether I agree with the French position on this. They made that decision. And as a result of it, their nuclear arsenal is sort of detached, if you will, from NATO's integrated nuclear infrastructure. That's their decision. It creates, of course, another element, another component in the dynamic between East and West, that there's a third country, so to speak, between Russia on the one side, NATO being the United States, Britain, and the few countries that have sort of support roles for nuclear weapons, and then France. So there is that element to it. But in reality, the French are operating and coordinating their nuclear forces and their strategy pretty close to what NATO is doing. It's not identical, but they're sort of aligned in many other issues, economic and diplomatic issues, that influences the way they think about their role of nuclear weapons as well.
Thank you. And with regard to previous nuclear weapons accidents on both Greenland and Spain, and that all French land-based aircraft nuclear warheads are located only some 200 kilometers from Paris. I have a twofold question. What is your opinion about the location, and how significant is the risk of a nuclear blast from this location, and what would be the consequences in both lives and destruction?
So the risk of a nuclear explosion is considered very low. Modern nuclear weapons have safety and security features that make it very unlikely that they could detonate in a way that sets off a significant nuclear blast. That said, you can have other accidents, of course. You can have accidents where a nuclear weapon becomes involved in a transport. But so are the other nuclear bases in Europe where the United States stores nuclear weapons. So, these potential risks are present everywhere where there are nuclear weapons, but they're also present in the form of transportation accidents that can happen. We know this has been an issue of some discussion between the United States and the Dutch government over the years because of transports and the responsibility for who should pay if something happened. So these issues are ongoing. And they will be with us as long as there are nuclear weapons deployed. So it's about how to manage it, if you will.
Excellent, thank you. And then we're going to check if there are any questions in the chat, or else we'll move on. Blanche?
Thank you, Mr. Kristensen. So we have a few questions. The first one is from Thorsten. So Thorsten is asking, is it naive to let Iran develop nuclear power? Does Iran pose a risk today?
Significantly increasing the enrichment of uranium that could be converted potentially to nuclear weapons use if they decided to do so. However, there's no indication, according to the most recent statements we have from the U.S. intelligence community, that Iran, is planning to do that. But there's no obvious other reason for enriching your fissile material to the extent that Iran is doing today. So that raises some very serious questions about what their intentions are and certainly what their potential options are in the near future. But I also just want to remind people that even if they do enrich uranium to a high degree that is usable in nuclear weapons, they still have a number of hurdles they would have to overcome if they wanted to have an operational nuclear weapon. Because of the fissile material obviously has to be incorporated into a device that actually works and can be used as a nuclear weapon. So there are a number of other technological challenges that would have to go through. So it is not an immediate nuclear threat, but it's a potential longer-term problem, absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Kristensen. We have a second question from Karin. This one is longer. So the island UK has only nuclear-based missiles, all stored in the submarines. France has land-based nuclear warheads as well as submarine missiles. What are the different purposes of the land-based and the submarine-based nuclear missiles, please?
Which country were you asking about? Sorry.
The island UK. The UK.
Oh, United Kingdom.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, so the United Kingdom has one type of nuclear weapons, which is sea-based ballistic missiles. It has 4 submarines. One of those submarines is normally out at sea. And so the way they look at their nuclear weapons is sort of secure retaliatory capability, that if somebody attacked Britain with overwhelming force and catastrophe, they would always have that response option hiding in the oceans. They can increase the number of submarines that are carrying nuclear weapons out at sea. They can send more out, maximum 3. And that's the kind of posture they have. Obviously now they decided to increase the number of weapons they want in their stockpile over the next decade. So that means that they're looking to expand the number of targets that can be held at risk with their nuclear forces. If you're talking a country that also has air-based system like France, for example, they both have submarines and land-based nuclear delivery systems. They're thinking of using land-based fighter jets with cruise missiles sort of in an earlier phase, if you will, of a nuclear deterrence standoff, where the submarines are intended to be sort of the last resort of the retaliatory capability. So, and Russia has, tactical nuclear weapons as well, and lots of them and more types, and they consider them more important for their military uses. So different countries use nuclear weapons and see their value in very different ways, depending on exactly how they have structured their nuclear forces.
Thank you, Mr. Kristensen. I think we are done with the questions for now. Oscar, if you want.
Treaties for nuclear disarmament, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT, effective in 1970, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, enforced since January 2021. And to accomplish the United Nations Agenda of Disarmament, the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs has set up 40 actions and 130 steps across the arms control and disarmament agenda, and 13 of the actions concern mass destructive weapons like nuclear weapons. And lastly, the UN has set 2030 as a time for elimination of all nuclear weapons. So my question is, Hans Kristensen, do you believe that the United Nations has done everything they can when it comes to nuclear disarmament, or are they capable to do more? And if they're capable to do more, what can the UN realistically do more?
Well, they've done a lot, and they have some, like you mentioned, a lot of really important achievements assembled over the years. But let's remember, the United Nations is a compilation of countries. The United Nations cannot do anything that the member countries don't want to do. And so to the extent that there is political will, it can do a lot. If countries fight each other and don't agree with the agenda or the urgency of it, it will not be able to do it. A good example, of course, is the nuclear ban treaty recently entered into force. There are lots of countries who are backing up behind that treaty, but those are countries that don't have nuclear weapons. And they're countries that tend not to be in alliance with nuclear weapon states. So countries that don't have them really want those that have them to get rid of them. But those that have them don't want to get rid of them. And so how do you solve this problem? And during the Cold War, nuclear arms control treaties and limitations mainly emerged as a result of deep concern about the arms race, deep concern about the risks. We've had sort of a honeymoon now of 2 decades where the international community has gotten a little relaxed when it comes to nuclear weapons issues. We focused on Iran, North Korea, proliferation of nuclear weapons, but we didn't honestly spend too much time in thinking about the existing nuclear weapon states that have thousands of them. Now we're entering that phase again, where the risk from those countries will increase again. So it may be that in the near future, within the next decade or so, or even 5 years from now or 10 years from now, that the international community and the United Nations will become more active again and try to hammer through these issues and put pressure on nuclear weapon states in a refreshed way, so to speak, that fits today. But they can only do as much as the countries that are members of the United Nations are willing to do.
Thank you, Mr. Kristensen. And also, what other organizations have an important part in the world nuclear disarmament?
Well, obviously, the International Atomic Energy Agency has a hugely important role in the sense of monitoring the countries that are members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty do not secretly develop capabilities or plans to develop nuclear weapons. So that's a very important function. That agency, of course, is also dependent on the goodwill of the countries that are supporting it. But that it has played an important role with limiting the proliferation of nuclear weapons to more countries. So there are a number of institutions, and of course also regional security institutions, whether they be in Europe or they're in the Pacific or South Asian region, that are trying to influence the way security structures are evolving. And I want to mention here that I think it's very important that the nuclear security, the future of the nuclear security on this planet is not just about nuclear weapons. It's also about the role of military power and how big military powers operate those military forces. Because if they create insecurity, then I think it is an illusion to think that nuclear weapon states will say, oh, sure, we can give up our nuclear weapons. That's not going to happen. And so the trick is to create sort of a grand strategy, if you will, that on the one hand reduces military tension in general, beefs up arms control agreements to limit and manage those relations, and at the same time continue efforts to reduce the numbers and the role of nuclear weapons. But that's a bigger project than just saying, I don't like nukes.
Do you have any questions? Thank you, Ms. Kristensen. And it doesn't seem like we have any questions, so we can go on to the final section. So a little hard drawn, I can imagine that, well, the agenda for nuclear disarmament is governed by the interest of the people. So if there's little interest from the people, there will be little activity by the politicians. And I assume that the largest existential threat in the 50s and 60s was the nuclear race between the US and the then USSR. And at, well, present, almost all focus is on the environment as the key existential threat.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you believe that nuclear disarmament gets the right attention by the politicians and the general public? And is the issue underestimated?
Right now, I think there is far too little attention in terms of what to do about it. There's too much focus on reacting to nuclear problems. we haven't quite yet figured out how are we going to structure sort of the counter-nuclear and the counter-military tension. The number of important treaties have fallen away over the last 10 years that regulated nuclear weapons. And some of those obviously had to do with the fact that they were from the Cold War. And some people saw them as outdated. Now, increased tension is sort of staring us in the face again. And it seems to me that the countries, whether they're part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty or in general security structures like NATO or Asian South Asian organizations, have to somehow figure out how to bring their concern in a focused manner forward, and so we can change this development. Because otherwise, indications are that we are rapidly moving down an increasingly more dangerous security environment where nuclear weapons also are going to play a larger role. And that would be a big mistake to go in that direction. We saw where that went during the 1950s and 60s, and it took us a lot of decades to get out of that situation. So here it is, staring us in the face once again, and countries have to pay more attention to this. Governments have to be more aggressive in their efforts to try to pressure nuclear weapon states and large military powers to calm down what they're doing. There are many ways to do that. Sanctions obviously work a certain way, political conversations, diplomacy, what have you. I mean, there are many ways to work this problem, but it's important that we get started and we get serious about it.
Thank you. And one question on FAS, how do organizations like FAS work when it comes to collecting information and then informing interested parties about the information FAS has?
Well, so we're based on a couple of key assumptions. And one, of course, is that factual information is extraordinarily important to have an informed public debate that informs politicians, that informs national policies. If you don't have that, then you're sort of in an action-reaction mode. So accountability is part of information. That if we have factual information, we can engage governments about what they're doing. We can address issues about trends. Where do we come from? What are the outlook for the next decade? And what are some of the changes we can come up with that could modify this development and calm things down a bit? And so we very much focus on the nuclear aspect of that in the project that I'm working on. But we also have a project that works on government secrecy, because too much secrecy is enormously harmful for an informed public debate. And most recently, we've also broadened our agenda to look more at the impact of technology on security issues like artificial intelligence, et cetera. So there are a number of issues where we're trying to provide transparency, provide factual information and analysis, and inform lawmakers and the news media also about where are we. So it's a multi-tier effort.
Thank you, Mr. Kristensen. And if it's okay by you, I have a very last question. So on the 26th of September, it is the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons. And my question is basically, what are you going to do on this special day, and what do you encourage us to do?
Well, we're going to beef up our availability of factual information on our website and make it more readily available for people to use. We are monitoring on a day-by-day basis what the nuclear weapon states are doing and bringing that out into the public. We've just had a big story about China building new missile silos. And that has opened and helped open up a debate about the nature of that. So again, transparency, factual information underpins what we're trying to do in our work.
Thank you, Ms. Kristensen. And with that question, we will end this webinar on the topic of status of worldwide nuclear arsenals. So we thank you a lot, our guest, Hans Kristensen, the director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists, for helping us better understand the status and issues of the worldwide nuclear issue. And so, many thanks to you, Mr. Kristensen, for spending time with us explaining the nuclear weapons issue. Thank you a lot.
Thanks very much for having me. And if people have questions, obviously do contact me. I'll be happy to help with any information I can. Thank you.
Thank you so much.